Well, good evening, and welcome to another edition of WordUp Wednesday. We are back. I know last week we were off because we hosted the Night of Hope on Wednesday, and then we also hosted the Mass Council of Churches, the Sound of the Trumpet Preaching Conference all last week. But we are back with Bible study, so do me a favor, like, love, and share this with someone. Let someone know that we're on tonight, and let's get it on. Let's get into it. Let's go to God in prayer. God, I thank you for this day. I thank you for our time together, and I ask your blessings upon us as we study your word. I pray, oh God, that you would allow this word to impact our hearts, to make a difference in our lives, so that then we can go out and make a difference in the lives of others. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so at the beginning of October, if you've been with us, even on Sundays, we entered into this new Bible study and even this new preaching series because October for us is Discipleship Month. And though the word discipleship doesn't necessarily appear in the New Testament, the root word, which is disciple, does appear. And to be a disciple, we understand that it is to be a learner or an apprentice being guided and taught by a master teacher. It's a learner or an apprentice being guided by a master teacher. Now, there are several examples of this throughout the Bible. We have Moses and Joshua. You have Ruth and Naomi. You have Paul and Timothy. You have Elijah and Elisha. And then you have, of course, Jesus and the 12 disciples. We also looked at a week before last that we defined discipleship. I gave you my definition. It's written on your study guide. And if you don't have it, I'll read it to you in its entirety. Discipleship for me, this is how I'm defining it. It's the ongoing process of following Jesus, being transformed by Jesus, and helping others do the same. It is life with Christ lived out in character, community, and mission. It's the ongoing process of following Jesus, being transformed by Jesus, and helping others do the same. And over, the past week and this week and even for the next two, what we've been doing, we've been journeying through the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus's most famous discourse, one of the most famous discourse of Jesus. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And it's found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And it constitutes really as the blueprint for what it really means to be a disciple, or the blueprint for discipleship. Sermon on the Mount begins with what we call as the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in the spirit, for, theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And the Beatitudes for us shows us really not what to do, but they show us who we are to be. The Beatitudes don't start by telling us what to do. Instead, they are given by Jesus describing who we are to be, which shows us that before discipleship is ever about behavior or actions, it's first about identity and character. Discipleship is about who we are to be before it's about what we are to do. Tonight, we're going to continue in chapter 5, but we'll be examining how Jesus begins to challenge how people think, or thought rather, about righteousness. The religious leaders of Jesus' day measured righteousness by external actions, like keeping the law. But when Jesus comes on the scene, he redefines righteousness by going beyond the law to showing us that righteousness really starts with the heart. According to Jesus, as he trains his disciples, he shows them and shows us that righteousness is something that begins within the heart that then flows outward. All right? Righteousness is something that begins within the heart and then it flows outwardly. So here's our leading question for tonight. When you hear the word righteousness, or maybe perhaps holiness, what comes to your mind? How would you define it? How would you define righteousness? How would you define holiness if somebody asked you to specifically, explain to them what either one might be for you? When you hear the word righteousness, when you hear the word holiness, whichever one, what comes to mind and how would you define it? Realizing that all of us have our own interpretation and our own way of examining and looking at righteousness and holiness, but I want to see what you might put down on your study guide or in the comment section. Listen, do me a favor, if you have not done so, like, love, and share this. Like, love, and share this. Share, love, and like this now, and let others know that Bible Studies On with Paz here on St. John's social media pages. All right? What comes to mind when you think of holiness? What comes to mind when you think of righteousness? And or how would you define it? Now, many of us, as you're writing, think of righteousness in terms of doing the right thing or being right. We think of it as avoiding the wrong thing. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus shows us that righteousness isn't just about proper behavior, but it's about a right heart. Righteousness would somewhat be defined as being in right standing with God and with people. Many people like to equate holiness with perfection. But holiness isn't perfection, but it's really about alignment. It's being so shaped by God's character that our thoughts, our motives, and actions reflect him. A lot of times, both righteousness and holiness, people tend to think that it deals with appearance, how you dress, what you do and what you don't do, right? But it really has something to do with attitude and internal actions over appearances. Now, we know that there are several faith practices and faith movements like the Holiness Church, the Apostolic, the Pentecostals, who look at holiness really and they define it by appearances. But that's not how Jesus is really explaining righteousness and or holiness. It has nothing to do really with appearance, but it really has something to do with attitude and internal actions. So let's dig into this and we'll discover how Jesus really looks at righteousness and how Jesus looks at holiness. All right? So our limit tonight is Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 48. Now, I promise you, I probably won't read all of it, but we'll do it as much as we can. The language is Greek since we're in the New Testament. The location is Galilee. Some would say that it's probably situated near Capernaum, but we're really in Galilee. The links to this text, especially Matthew 5 or the Sermon on the Mount, would be Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 49, where Jesus in Luke's gospel deals with the Sermon on the Plain. And then our leads, Jesus, 12 disciples, and possibly this large crowd. All right, let's move into this text. Let's see how far we get tonight. Y'all know we'll get to all of it, but let's dive into it. All right. In verses 1 through 16 of Matthew 5, Jesus gave us or described to us the character of a disciple with the Beatitudes. They are to be poor in spirit. They are to be those who mourn. Jesus also gave us the influence of a disciple. We are to be salt and light. But in these verses 17 through 48, Jesus moves to defining the conduct of a disciple. What Jesus does in verses 17 through 48 is define the conduct of a disciple. And he emphasizes what we would call a deeper righteousness, right way of living, right way of being in alignment with God and even with people, right? And what he does is he goes beyond legalistic obligations or obedience to the law, and he moves into something that penetrates the heart. Righteousness for Jesus goes beyond legalistic obedience and obligation. It's really something that cultivates, changes, and penetrates the heart. All right? And how Jesus does this, in this particular text, there are 6 sections that Jesus highlights. 6 sections. First section, verses 21 through 26, Jesus deals with murder and anger. Or murder and anger. They're both murder and or anger. These are called the 6 antitheses. The 6 antitheses, right? These are, we know what an antithesis is, and I'll explain to it more, but an antithesis is a contrast or opposition between two things. It's a contrast or opposition between two things. Jesus lists the 6 antitheses. You got murder and anger. Then you have, in verse 27 through 30, adultery and lust. Then he moves to divorce. Then he deals with oaths. Then he deals with retaliation. Finally, he ends with love for enemies. So we got murder and anger, adultery and lust, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and then love for enemies. And what you'll discover in each section, that Jesus will begin by saying these words: you have heard it said. You have heard. You have heard it was said, right? But then he'll always end by saying, but I say to you. All right? You have heard, but I say to you. And this is to show Jesus' authority to interpret and also fulfill the law. Now, in the words of Dr. Oprah Hendricks, we understand Jesus' mission and purpose when Jesus came to this earth. Jesus never came to innovate the law. He came to fulfill it. Jesus did not come to innovate the law, but he came to fulfill it. Jesus does not come to erase the law, but he does expose how shallow our understanding and obedience can be when our hearts are untouched. So Jesus doesn't come to erase the law, but he comes to expose how shallow our obedience can be when our hearts are untouched. All right? So let's dig into this. First lesson comes from verses 17 through 20, and this is what the text teaches us in verse 17 through 20, that true righteousness flows from relationships and not rules. True righteousness flows from relationship and not rules. not discrediting or disregarding the law or the rules that were made, because, they are set in place to govern and to be used as a measuring rod, not discrediting, not disregarding those things. Jesus, however, reveals that righteousness was never meant to be reduced to rule keeping. Do not think, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, verse 17, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, Jesus is telling us, honestly, that true righteousness is not about regulation, but true righteousness flows from a relationship. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and all of the religious leaders in Jesus' day followed the law externally, but their hearts were far removed from God. They honored God with their lips, but they didn't do it with their lives. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus comes to realign righteousness with its original intent, which was to draw people closer to God, not simply control their conduct. The rules, the law that was given was not just to control your conduct, but it was given so that people can draw closer to God. That's why Jesus opens up the section by making it clear in verse 17. Hey, I didn't come to abolish it, but I came to fulfill it. And to fulfill something, we know that it is to lead it to its end or to realize it completely. The issue with the religious leaders, the Pharisees, was that they were do as I say people. But they weren't following what was taught themselves. They weren't following it themselves because they had yet to develop a genuine relationship with God. Their understanding of God was solely on keeping the law, but even in that, they missed it. They missed it because they picked which ones they wanted to follow and excluded the very ones that needed to be followed. That's why Jesus had a problem with the Pharisees and the scribes for not taking care of orphans, for not taking care of widows. Why do you say you follow the law, but you don't do right by them? So when Jesus says in verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he is not asking the disciples, nor is he asking us to outperform them, but he's really calling us to a deeper level than them. He wants people to live out a different kind of righteousness, not just a righteousness that thinks that the only way you can be right is if you follow every law, but you know good and well you're not going to follow it. You can't follow every law. That's not what the law was given for. Jesus says, listen, it was really given for us to draw closer to God. So what does this tell us about discipleship? Here it is. That a disciple's conduct isn't about checking boxes or keeping scores, but it's really about living in right relationship with God. We don't follow the rules to earn God's favor. No, we already have that because we belong to God. But we obey God because we want to strive to maintain this relationship that's not based on fear, but it's based on love and genuine respect. You think about parenting, right? And if you force a child to follow rules out of fear, they'll never develop a genuine relationship with you. They'll do what you asked, all because they are afraid of you. But think about it. If you want obedience, you have to approach it differently, right? It ain't always just about rules, but it's about making sure that they know, hey, even when I don't do right, I can still come to you. And obedience that is born out of fear, out of duty, produces performance. But obedience that flows from relationship produces change, produces transformation. The Pharisees followed rules to prove their righteousness. But that's not how disciples do it. Disciples follow the rules, the words of Jesus, really because we want to pursue righteousness. Not to prove it, but we want to pursue it. There's a difference in motives here. When the Pharisees did what they did, they performed because it was driven by pressure to appear holy. But when we try to live right, our desire is not to appear holy before people, but our desire is to do right to please a holy God. True righteousness is not about rules. It's really about relationship. Because rules, watch this, rules can correct our actions, but only relationship can change our heart. Rules can correct actions, but only relationships can change hearts. All right? Here's the second lesson. When we look at verses 21 through 37, we're going to go through 4 of these antitheses. The text will show us that true righteousness begins in the heart, not in behavior. All right? 4 antitheses are listed. Remember, I'll say it again. An antithesis, A-N-T-I-T-H-E-S-I-S, an antithesis is a contrast or opposition between 2 things. And throughout the text, remember, Jesus will say, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And what Jesus does, Jesus turns to 4 everyday examples that expose the difference between external obedience and internal transformation. All right, he shows us the difference of, all right, this is what the rule says, but this is really how you ought to live it. All right, remember, Jesus is not adding new laws, he's uncovering the heart behind the old ones. And overall, when we deal with all of this, this is what I want you to take away from this. Here's the insight that I want you to take away with this. That discipleship involves heart transformation. And Jesus doesn't just clean up our actions, but he also changes our motives, our emotions, and our desires. Discipleship involves heart transformation, and Jesus doesn't just come into our lives to clean up our actions, but Jesus comes to change our motives, emotions, and desires. Look at the first one. That's anger and murder. And while some of our subscriptions use murder in the text, what Jesus is after in these verses is what causes a person to probably commit murder. And Jesus says the root of it stems from anger. The root is Anger. Now, in the Old Testament, the law, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, condemns the outward act of taking a life. But Jesus, in fulfilling the law, takes it a step further. And he identifies the inner emotions that leads to the act. And for Jesus, anger isn't just an emotion. It's the seed of destruction. It begins quietly in the heart, and if left unchecked, it grows into resentment, bitterness, hatred, and it even involves violence. And while we look at murder being egregiously wrong, which it is, right? The problem isn't only what we do with our hands, it's what we have allowed to live in our hearts. So look at what Jesus says in verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. And whoever murders, verse 21, shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to counsel. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to hell of fire. So, when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first and reconcile to your brother and sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with them, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Now, what Jesus really goes back to, even though the scripture talks about thou shalt not kill, Jesus says this really starts with a person harboring anger. And what Jesus is getting after here is that harboring anger is already a form of murder because it kills relationships. It destroys peace, and it violates the love that should mark a disciple's heart. And he calls for those who follow not simply to avoid killing, not just to avoid killing, but also to make sure you pursue reconciliation. You can get angry, but don't stay angry forever. Jesus says, that's why he says, now if you're getting ready to offer your gift on the altar, present a gift or a sacrifice on the altar, and you remember someone has something against you, before you give that offering, make it right with them first. If you know that you've got something, or if you're holding something against somebody, right? Make it right first before you try to make it right with God. Get that anger out of you first, because according to the text, that anger is just as bad as murder. All right? Look at where he goes to next. Verses 27 through 30. Jesus deals with lust and adultery. And he continues pressing deeper into the heart by addressing lust. Now, in the Old Testament, it condemned adultery, which we know, according to the Old Testament, is the physical act of unfaithfulness. But Jesus reveals that the problem doesn't begin with what happens, in the bedroom. It begins with what happens in a person's heart. That the problem begins long before the act of unfaithfulness begins. All right? Look at what the text says. You have heard it said that you should not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman or man with lust has already committed adultery within their heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, because it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go to hell. Now, this is some harsh language, don't you think? And for Jesus, he's saying lust is adultery of the heart. And it's not only about what we do with our bodies, but what we allow to dwell in our minds and dwell in our hearts. Because to look with lust, Jesus says, means that you've already entertained the thought. And you've already entertained the thought that objectifies another person or treats them as a means to satisfy desire. What he's telling us is that what we look at can shape our heart. And he uses some shocking language here, right? Because he says, now, if your right eye calls you to sin, or if your right hand calls you to sin, cut it out, cut it off. And this, y'all, is not to promote self-harm. No. But he says these things to address the seriousness of unchecked temptation. We are, as disciples, to guard our eyes and to guard our hearts. And we guard our hearts by guarding our eyes. What you see can start to influence you internally and cause you to fall into a trap that you might not be able to get out of so easily. Then he moves to divorce and unfaithfulness. Now, in Jesus' time, divorce had become common and it had become casual, especially among men. And many rabbis taught that a husband could dismiss his wife for almost any reason. Maybe she burnt the food, or maybe she lost favor in his eyes. And the rabbis taught that they could just dismiss a woman for that cause. You can find that, right? And the law, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, permitted divorce under certain conditions. And it was really given to promote women or to protect women from being abandoned without legal rights or provision. But by the time Jesus comes along, that permission had been twisted into permission for selfishness. Instead of protecting covenant, people used it, men in particular, to justify convenience. Men could only, it was one-sided, don't you know, men could only extend a bill of divorce, but they did it as a loophole to escape covenant responsibilities. They wanted a divorce so that they did not have to remain faithful to their spouse. So when Jesus speaks of divorce in Matthew 5, hear me clearly. He is not saying that divorce is never permissible. We know from other passages like Matthew chapter 19 or 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that Scripture allows divorce in certain instances. Maybe like for sexual immorality or abandonment by an unbelieving spouse and other issues and things, right? But what Jesus is addressing, Jesus is not telling us that divorce is damaging and deadly. But what Jesus is doing, he's addressing the hardness of a heart that treats marriage as disposable and commitment as optional. Jesus is not creating an impossible burden, but he's confronting a hardened heart culture that turned covenant into convenience. You get tired of them, so you can, write a bill of divorce. And what he's doing here in this text is he's trying to restore the sacredness of covenant, not to add shame to those who have experienced divorce. And why he lifts it up, here it is, here's the disciples' insight. He calls his disciples to view relationships with people the same or with the same faithfulness and grace that God shows towards us. Now, let's look at what he says, verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, let's examine this. Let me take some time in here, because there are many people who don't believe in divorce because of this verse. And they even condemn folks who are divorced and have remarried, which is problematic, which becomes problematic when placed in the wrong hands. Now, if taken out of context, it can appear that Jesus is condemning every divorced person, or really labeling women who were divorced as an adulteress, even if they were innocent in this whole ordeal. Then, if you take this out of context, it can make their remarriage appear sinful, turning the victim into the violator, and that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus's intent is not to punish women or bind people to an unjust circumstances, but to protect, really, the sanctity of covenant. What Jesus is saying, hey, listen, don't just offer a bill of divorce out of convenience, but let there be a real reason as to why, hey, there needs to be some separation. This is not to shame people who have been divorced or going through a divorce. Because I'm going to tell you right now, whoever shares that, they're not telling you the right thing. That's not what Jesus is doing here. That's not Jesus's intent. And I know we live in a world where it's so easy to misinterpret what is being said, because it fits what you want to believe. All right? Then Jesus tackles oaths and honesty. Verse 33. Again, you've heard it said, to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. What is Jesus saying? What Jesus is really dealing with, he's addressing truthfulness. He's addressing truthfulness. And perhaps people in his day use oaths to give weight to their words. They swore by heaven. I swear, by heaven and earth that I'll do this. I swear, we say it right now. I swear to God, stuff like that. We say that, right? To sound convincing. But Jesus says such oaths often become loopholes to manipulate truth. Jesus says, all right, you ain't got to swear. You ain't got to use no. Let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. In other words, your words as a disciple should be trustworthy without needing anything else attached to it. Truth telling. If you're going to say you're going to do something, do it, because truth telling should be our default posture. Not just something that we say occasionally, right? And if God has got a truth, then God's people should be people of truth, and they should reflect the same integrity. Our credibility as a disciple depends not on how religiously we speak or how well we speak, but really, hey, if what we say is followed through. That's why Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. If you're going to say you're going to do something, do it. If you know you can't do it, don't say you can. That's truthfulness. That's honesty. All right? Here's the last thing. Here's the last lesson that this text teaches us. The true righteousness is measured by love, not by limits. Now, in verses 38 through 47, Jesus, again, pushes the disciples even further. And what he does is he pushes them beyond fairness, right? He pushes beyond fairness to forgiveness and love for enemies. Jesus redefines holiness through this radical love that mirrors God's own heart. Now, the law, if you're going to go by the law, measured justice this way: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the principle, right? That's law in Exodus 21:24. That's what the law says. Since you're going to follow it, then an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy. Now, the law says this is what fairness, this is what justice looks like, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus says, hey, listen, don't go by that as a means to justify revenge. That's not what we do. Jesus isn't even promoting passivity. He's not promoting injustice, but he calls the disciples to overcome evil with good. Your instinct, I know, is to retaliate. That's your natural instinct. That's our natural instinct. I'm going to get you before you get me again. I'm going to get you because I done got and I don't want to get got again, right? I'm going to get you. Jesus says, all right, I understand that, but when there's a heart change, you reject the idea of retaliation, but you embrace restraint. Instead of getting even, you go the extra mile. Instead of demanding rights, you demonstrate grace. And this ain't weakness. Now, don't let nobody punk you either. That's what Jesus really said. Now, listen, wait a minute. Don't let nobody punk you. But if there is a way for you to be the bigger person, especially if something that might have happened doesn't, call for extreme measures of violence and retaliation, be the bigger person. Be the bigger person. Don't let it get to you so much. I know. They shouldn't have done it. I know. And that's That's something that we have to sit with, right? I know they shouldn't have said what they said. I know they shouldn't have reacted the way they reacted. I know, right? But Proverbs tells us, hey, when you retaliate and go tit for tat, it makes you look like a fool too. And sometimes we win over those who probably have done us wrong when we either learn how to walk away or kill them with our kindness. They ain't expecting you to speak to them, but you speak to them anyway. They waiting. They waiting for the moment for you to come up to them and say something slick, even though I know you want to. But you do the complete opposite. And let me tell you, that's not weakness. That's showing great strength. Now, when we get to verses 43 to 48, Jesus deals with this kingdom conduct. The law commanded, love your neighbor. But it added an unspoken counterpart which said, but hate your enemy. Jesus dismantles that and says, all right, I know what you heard from Leviticus chapter 19, but I'm going to tell you something different. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. If God can love the ungrateful and the wicked, if God can reign on the just and the unjust alike, then why can't we do the same thing? The highest mark of discipleship is not how we treat those who love us, but how we love those who, watch this, who oppose us. Now, I'm going to be honest. It's impossible in our strength. It is impossible. But when we do it in God's strength, it becomes easy. It's impossible as a human to turn the other cheek, to really ask God, instead of striking them, God, forgive them. It's hard to do that because some days I don't want to be Christian. I mean, let's just be honest. I don't want to be the better person, the bigger person. I want to get low like you. I am not Michelle Obama. When they go low, we go high. No, there are days when I feel like when people go low, I want to go lower. I want to go lower. It's almost like I want to go down there where Satan is, right? And I just want to bring him up with me. That's how I be. When people go low with you, in the grocery store, that's where I really get it the most. I really get it the most in the grocery store. And I'd be like, Lord, especially them days when I'm wearing St. John's apparel. I can't go in here and I can't act like I really want to act. So I got to smile. I got to say, you know what? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Now, there's something on the inside of me that is cringing. But you know what? I got to be holy. I got to be righteous. I got to act like I do not want to bring shame on the people that I love and the people that I serve. And I don't want to bring shame on God. But let me tell you how bad I want to go low. I want to go low. And don't look at me in that tone of voice. You know you go low all the time. And I know you want to go low, right? I want to go low too. I want to be there right with you. But Jesus says, nope, that ain't how it works. And you know why? I do believe that those of us who know better, we get it worse from God when we know what we ought to do, but we don't do it. It's almost like God is like, now I've told you time and time again, don't do that, and yet you did it. And it seems like the punishment from God is worse than what they ever did to me. So what is Jesus calling us? Jesus is not calling us to lower the standards of righteousness, but he's really raising it. He's raising it not to condemn us, but he's raising it to change and transform us. And he takes the law that we've heard and turns it inward and reminds us that true discipleship isn't about what we do. Once again, it's about who we are becoming. And so here's what I need you to do this week. We need to ask God to show us one area in our life, or in our heart rather, where our righteousness has become more about rule keeping than relationships. And invite God to show us how not just to obey it out of fear and out of just wanting to look perfect, but rather how to embody it. How to allow it to become a part of us in such a way that we just don't do it just to perform, but we do it because we know, hey, this is what we want to do. That's what we need to do this week. Ask God to show us the area in our heart where our righteousness has become performative, where we just do it because, or we want to look pure and sanctified and holy. Ask God to show us, hey, where can we change? Where can we do right? Not because we want to appear to be right, but we want to please you. And then invite God to show us how we don't just obey God's word out of fear, but we do it because we really want to embody it. All right? We got to go. Don't forget, I believe tickets sales for our women's fellowship has ended. I think it closed at 5 o'clock today. So if you didn't do it, I am so sorry. Shame on you. We keep telling you, hey, get to it on time. Don't forget that this Sunday, because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we're wearing purple. Also, don't forget that tickets are on sale for our church anniversary weekend, taking place November 7th through the 9th. We got movie night on the 7th, the day party on the 8th, and then we have worship on the 9th. Also, we have Connection Sunday on this coming Sunday. If you're not connected to a ministry, this is an opportunity for you to connect, to serve, and to grow. We got to go, but until we meet again, I love you. Peace.